Welcome, everyone. We're always so happy to be learning with you here at Drisha. This is a new special class for us, conversations on the Parashah. Each week, we will have different members from Drisha learning community. And today, we're getting started with Rabbi David Silber and Rabbanit Leah Sarna. Just a few words about how we run the classes for those who are new with us. I recognize most faces, but I'm going to be sending you an invitation to become a panelist. Just if you would like to participate in the class and be able to unmute, make sure to accept that invitation. Please stay muted when you're not speaking, just so we can kind of keep the class without unnecessary background noise, but feel free to unmute whenever you would like to share anything. You can also engage in writing here in the chat box on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook. Just a few words about Rabbi David Silber, for those who might be joining us for the first time. He's the founder and dean of Drisha. In addition to being a world-renowned Bible lecturer, he's the author of 3 books, Haggadah, a book on Megillat Esther, and a recent book on Sefer Shmuel. Rabbanit Leah Sarna, who's also with us, is a member of Drisha's faculty and our director of teen programs. And with that, I'll just turn this to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Good to be here. This is the first of a series, as Evie said, on the weekly Torah reading, and typically it's called the conversation. So the two of us, myself and Rabbanit Leah, will be talking about this week's Parashah. I'll take the lead on this one. So what I wanted to look at is the 15th chapter of Shemot, Book of Exodus, chapter 15, which of course is the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam. And there's no question that Shirat Hayam, the song that Moshe and Israel sing upon leaving Egypt, and the Egyptians are chasing after them with the chariots, and they come up to the sea, the Red Sea of Reeds, actually, and they stop there. In front of them is the sea. Behind them is the Egyptian army approaching. People are frightened, and they're commanded just to move forward. And the waters part, as we know. They walk through. The Egyptians try to chase after them and to capture or kill them, and they are drowned in the sea. And at that point, we're told that Moshe and Israel sing this song. It's a song about God's victory, the triumph of God. It's a song which speaks of the destruction of the horde of the Egyptians who were chasing after them. That's clear in the Torah. I would say it's fair to say that this particular shirah, this song, is by far and away the most significant song that we have in our tradition, for any number of reasons. One of them, not the main one, is that the Song of the Sea actually figures quite prominently in our prayers. It's referenced both in the morning prayer after the reading of the Shema, it's the blessing after the Shema, which concludes with reference to the Song of the Sea, Shira Chadasha, Shebchu Giyurim. It mentions a couple of verses from the Song of the Sea, Mi Chamocha, who is like you, O God, and God shall reign forever. And in the evening prayer, again after the Shema, it's the blessing that immediately follows the Shema. So for those reasons, it's quite familiar for those who will pray the traditional service. The Song of the Sea is quite familiar. On top of that, it's recited every morning as part of Psukei de Zimra, those sort of psalms or songs of praise that precede the blessings of the Shema. And Shirat Hayam typically is sung by Jews who are praying the morning service. So there are references to it in significant parts of our service. The recitation of the song itself is a common practice, a daily practice. So that's clear. What is actually, I think, more interesting is that the Song of the Sea is actually the basis for other songs. It's not our topic right now, but I've written about this, spoken about it, how Hallel actually, that's recited on the festivals, also called Hallel HaMitzri, is to a large extent referencing and to some extent based on the Song of the Sea. And there are other parts of our tradition that reference the Song of the Sea. So let me just begin by making one observation about Shirat Hayam, and then perhaps Rabbanit Sarna can jump at any time, but I'll just stop then and see what she has to say. And again, feel free to unmute and speak up as well. So in terms of the Shirat Hayam, it is placed in a strategic place. It serves a kind of literary function. And the function that it serves is it's a marker in the story. That is to say, the first story that we encounter in the book of Exodus is about the Exodus. It's about leaving Egypt. So we know the plagues, and we leave Egypt, and the Egyptians are chasing after us, and we come to the sea, and moment of desperation, and then the waters part, we come to the other side. We come to the other side, it's marked by this very lengthy song. And what the song marks is what the Torah is saying to us, in effect, is this is the end of that part of the story. The physical exodus from the land of Egypt has taken place. And now we are beginning a new story, a new chapter in the story of the leaving of Egypt and entering and possessing the land. And that begins right after the Song of the Sea, after Shirat Hayam. We cross the sea, and the first place we encounter in this week's Parashah, right after we cross the sea, is the story of Mara, the story of the bitter waters, the first complaints. We're about to enter a desert, no obvious water, no food. And that's what the Parashah will deal with as well. But the journey begins after the Song of the Sea. This is a long song. What's interesting is that it's not surprising that upon leaving Egypt, the Torah records the song. But what is very surprising is the second song that appears in the Torah, which is found in the book of Bamidbar, for those who have Tanachim, chapter 21. And in Bamidbar, chapter 21, surprisingly, we have the following. Israel is traveling in the desert. The complaints, in chapter 20, we have the death of Aaron. In chapter 20, we have the death of Miriam. In chapter 20, we have Moshe being told he will not possess the land. And then Israel keeps traveling. In chapter 21, we're told that they're traveling in the desert, and they come to a place called Be'era, Be'er's a well. And suddenly the Torah says to us in chapter 21, very surprisingly, Oz Yashir Yisrael, in verse number 17 of Bamidbar, chapter 21, Oz Yashir Yisrael et Hashira Azot, Ali Be'er Enulah. That Israel sang a song, Oz Yashir, which is how the Song of the Sea begins. Here it's Israel, with us it's Moshe, Ubnei Yisrael, but Israel sings this song, and the song is a very brief song. It's about 3 verses. A well that was dug by princes, haShavua, Sarim, etc. It's a very brief song. And the question is, what is the song doing here? As we understand the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, we get it. That's the end of the Exodus, basically. That's successful Exodus from Egypt. The pursuing army has been destroyed. What is Shirat HaBe'er doing in chapter 21, a 3-verse song in the 21st chapter of the book of Bamidbar? And the solution to this problem is very interesting. And that is that if you read the next story, right after the Song of the Sea, which ends in chapter 21 of Bamidbar, verse number 20, in the very next verse, says that Israel sent messengers to Sichon, the king of Amori. Now, Sichon, the king of Amori, they send messages. They want to pass through the land, which he possesses, on the other side of the Jordan, because he's defeated Moab. Amori is the Canaanite king. And Sichon, the king of Amori, comes to attack Israel. And Israel defeats Sichon and captures his land. And the war against Sichon is the beginning of the conquest of the land. The actual crossing over the Jordan takes place in the next book of the Torah, of the Bible, book of Yoshua. But within the Torah itself, there are beginnings of conquest. And the first successful conquest of land is the Battle of Sichon. So the truth is that the song, actually, in Bamidbar, chapter 21, is again a marker. What the Torah is saying is the journey has basically come, that part of the story, the journey, that's coming to an end. Now we're beginning a third stage. after Exodus and after journey, conquest. That's the
There's
second song.
There's another quasi song in Dvarim chapter 4. You have Az Yavdil Moshe, when Moshe designates 3 cities of refuge, and the Midrash understands that, right? What does Az Yavdil Moshe sound like? It sounds like Az Yashir Moshe. And the Midrash understands that Moshe hummed to himself, or like sang to himself while he did it, which is like a really incredible idea. And I wonder whether that could like fit into this model that you're setting up, that these songs really designate different like sections of the Jewish story here. Like, we were doing the Exodus, now the Exodus is done, now we're at like, right, the Shirat Hayam designates, now we're going to be in the Midbar, and then Shirat HaBe'er designates, now we're going to start conquests. But Moshe, that's not Moshe's song, because Moshe doesn't really get to lead the conquests. So maybe the like Az Yavdil Moshe song is like, okay, well, the Jewish people are really moving on towards this part of their journey that he's not going to be able to continue on. He gets to kind of do this one little piece of designating these cities of refuge, and that's maybe his kind of swan song also.
I would have said the other way. I thought you were going the other direction. That actually, what in the Chumash, what is I think extremely interesting, is that the Chumash spends an enormous amount of time, relative amount of time, on the cities of refuge. It's almost the next to last chapter in the book of Bamidbar, which is, in other words, you can't possess the land without cities of refuge, because what cities of refuge allow for is for people to live together. Cities of refuge is one of the, so even though Moshe won't actually possess the land, but he's setting up the possibility of possessing, because without cities of refuge, there'll be a kind of internal violence, and the cities of refuge are designed to allow people to live together, because otherwise you have these feuds going back and forth. So I think the Oz over there may well be actually, yes, of course, what you say is true, that he won't actually possess the land at all, but he is doing something, those 3 cities of refuge on the other side of the Jordan.
To make it habitable.
Exactly.
Nice.
So that would actually fit in perfectly, actually, to make it habitable, because without these cities of refuge, without some mechanism within society to allow people to live together, we won't be able to stay there, as you say, to make it habitable. I was thinking actually, and this could have been a shir in its own right, but I just want to point something out, that when you get past the 5 books of Moshe, past the Torah, and one of the next great songs, maybe the one that's familiar to us, is the song that appears in the beginning of the book of Shoftim, and that's the song that's sung by Devorah. Oz Tashir Devorah, was it Devorah Barak? That's so in the book of Judges, which is a book about the various leaders, charismatic leaders of Israel, and there are many. Each leader is involved in a battle. What's very striking is that it's only Devorah actually in the 5th chapter of Judges, which is the Haftorah for this week's Parashah, by the way. The Haftorah, Vatasha Dvarah Ubarak Ben Avinoam, Vayomahu Lemar. There's a lot to say about that rather difficult, one of the difficult, songs in general have very difficult language, but this one has a particularly difficult language. But in any event, so, a question one could ask is, okay, there are many battles in the book of Judges. Why is it that Devorah gets all this space, this very long song? Why is it Devorah whose song is recorded in the book of Shoftim? After all, we know that, very often in wars, there are songs emerged from wars. Yerushalayim Shozahav is a recent memory, but you have, even in the war against Sichon, so there are typically songs, but only is the song of Devorah recorded. So I just wanted to make a suggestion, and I'll pause, which is that what's unique about Devorah actually is that Devorah celebrates the final war, as it were, with one exception, against Canaan. The enemy in Devorah's case is Yavin Melech Canaan and Sisera, the general of the Canaanites. And the defeat of Yavin and the kings of Canaan are a marker that actually the conquest of the land has essentially been completed. The only thing that's left in the Bible is the capture of Jerusalem, which King David does. But outside of that, all the other wars in Shoftim are not against the Canaanites. They're against external enemies. So the beginnings of the conquest is Sichon, and the culmination of the conquest is Devorah. And we had spent several weeks together. I could demonstrate that the language of Devorah's song both plays off the song of the sea and also Shirat HaBe'er. So really, it's a culmination. So these three songs form. There are other songs, but these three songs are three markers: the end of the bondage in Egypt, the beginning of the journey, the beginning of the conquest, and in Dvorah's case, the end of the conquest.
My grandfather, in his commentary on Shemot, points out that it's there's something unique about those two, the Shirat Dvorah and Shirat Hayam, which is that they have kind of a literary telling in prose of the story of the conquest or the Exodus or whatever, and then they have this poetic piece that comes after, the extensive poetic piece that comes after. And he says that it's an Egyptian literary genre that dates from the days of the New Kingdom. And that genre has these two accounts of the same event, first prose, then poetry. But what he says is different. He lists a whole series of them. So you have the epic battle of Pharaoh Ramses II against the Hittites. You have the battle of Pharaoh Merneptah against the Libyans. But what my grandfather points out is that both of the ones in the Torah, so both Shirat Hayam and Shirat Dvorah, they're very like God-centric, and the Egyptian ones are Pharaoh-centric. So in the Egyptian ones, it's all about this like human conquest, and in the Torah's ones, it's all about God conquest. And that shows that like that context reflects a very important part of our theology about like what war is and who is it that wins wars. So by taking that exact same kind of literary structure, but replacing the hero from a human hero to a God hero, once you know that structure kind of like exists in the world and maybe would have been known by its earliest readers, you really get a feel for how special these songs are.
Right. I would just say that certainly when it comes to Shirat Hayam, there's actually no mention of Israel at all. Actually, it's totally about God. Shirat HaBe'er doesn't mention God at all, which is very striking. God is conspicuously absent. In fact, they sing about themselves.
Right. No, I was thinking about Shirat Dvorah.
Right. So Shirat Dvorah, by the way, for those who don't know, that Leah's grandfather was Nachum Sarna, who was a very noted Bible scholar and also taught at Drisha. Right. He's written more than one book, exploring Exodus and others. He used to actually come to Drisha, and we loved to come to Drisha, and we loved that he was there. So, family tradition. I would just say that the Song of Devorah, this is a longer conversation. Certainly, God is very present, but I think it also plays off the other song, Hamit Nadvim Ba'am, etc. I think there's both are there. God is, of course, very present. That's for sure. But I do think that the people are also there, and it sort of plays off both. But okay, is there anything else you want to add? Anybody want to speak up?
Maybe it's a difference between first and second generation. Or first generation, it was God-centric at the Yam. And then later on, it was more people doing. The Shirat Be'er was, I think, the second generation writing it.
Right.
And when they speak about going to war, it's them. It's not even Moshe. And
right.
So I think that might, change things. And then the Ir Miklat I wrote in the chat, it's like a safety valve for the people. That's what it functions as, in my mind.
What do you mean by safety valve?
That rather than kill each other off, it lets them feel that there is justice. That's the function of the Ir Miklat. That they feel that they had a grievance, that it's being addressed, that they still have their honor, but they don't have to actually kill the person. So that's the safety valve.
I see. I mean, I was saying more in terms of taking it out of the hands of the individuals and putting it in the hands of a government. Like we have it in the US, the state versus X. Right? When it comes to capital cases, it's the state again, it's not the individual family anymore. is taken away from them, that to hopefully to prevent kind of violence we're familiar with when you don't have a strong government. Then different families, we have a tribal society to some extent.
Blood loss.
And there's a lot of, but your first point is a very good point in terms of one might say that the first song, which is only mentioning God, makes sense in terms of the first generation, who basically were slaves. They feel unempowered. The second generation, which is chapter 21, whatever in Egypt, they have the opposite problem. Kofi Yotzim Yadi. They think they do it all themselves. And then the Devorah song has both, I think, but that's a very important point. You wanted to add something to that?
No, I love it. I love the idea that there's it's very Hegelian,
Exactly, right. Yeah, exactly. It's the song is reflecting, it's reflecting where in this process within history, which is a good thing. Okay, so let me just move on to the next. People are encouraged to speak up, by the way. It's more than welcome to speak up. I did want to mention one other point about the Song of the Sea, which is the following point. This is the point that actually Kasuto makes this point in general. I believe he references the Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, but he makes a point in his commentary on Bereshit, I think from Adam to Noah. He has the following observation, which to him is very central. His claim that he makes, and this is actually similar to what the Rabbanit Leah quoted in terms of Professor Sarna, Nachum Sarna, that Kasuto sees the Bible as in some sense responding to the cultures of the ancient Near East. And in the first chapter of the Torah, which talks about creation, he makes the point that unlike all these other creation stories, or I think all of them, of the ancient Near East, where in the beginning of time, there's some kind of war taking place between different forces. And typically these forces are related to the deep waters. And names like Tiamat, which is Tahom, or Yam, or Rahav, or Nahar, these kinds of forces. There's a struggle between these forces, and then one of them emerges from the struggle. Unlike Kasuto claims, unlike that description of creation, we have these various competing forces. In the first chapter of the Torah, there's one God who creates everything and does so with no resistance whatsoever. Not only no resistance whatsoever, but there's no labor. It's just speech. Vayomer, God said this, God said. And Kasuto goes out of his way to have the following point, that in the creation story, he points out, which describes the sort of sets of things that are being created. But there's one exception to that, apart from the human being. There's one exception, which is on the fifth day, it says, Vayivra Elohim et hataninim hagdolim, that God created the great sea serpents. And Kasuto asks, why did the Torah single out the tanin, the sea serpents? And he makes the point that in other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, the tanin is one of the main players, very powerful. And here, no, God created this, the fish, the tanin. It's like it's all the same. As far as God is concerned, there's no struggle, there's no effort. It's just Vayomer, and there the tanin is. That's the first point Kasuto makes. And then he makes another point, which is very interesting, and that is, he says that where it's true, that in the first chapter of Genesis, the Torah describes a kind of effortless creation, no opposition, no effort. But he argues that if you look at the Bible in general, different parts of the Bible, in the Psalms, in the book of Eov, you will find references there to some other creation story. So, for example, Eov says, Eov's upset with God. Eov wants a trial. Eov says, Hayam anochi im tanin. What am I? Yam or tanin? I'm a little guy, he says. What do you pick on me for? This is not, it's a fight of unequals. I'm not the yam or the tanin. And there are various verses in the book of Psalms that speak of reference a completely different creation narrative. That's what Kasuto says. I remember reading that as a very young person, and it took it to heart and been thinking about that ever since. So what I wanted to put out there is that when you read Shirat Hayam, as it's called, the Song of the Yam, what's interesting is that there are two words that stand out. One is the word Yam, to the extent that, for example, at the very end of the song, let's find the very end of Shirat Hayam, end of chapter 15, we find that verse. Let's see. Kibosus paro b'richbo uvefarashav bayam, vayashev Hashem aleihem et mei hayam, uvenei Yisrael hochu bayabasha b'tol hayam. So it's there three times in that verse, which is the last verse. Then Miriam comes into it, and her last word is also yam. Miriam took the women out to sing, and Matan lahem Miriam shiru Hashem ki go ga'as sus v'rochvo ramah bayam. So the word yam, it's called Shirat Hayam for a reason, appears over and over again. The word tahom also appears twice. Tahom is another word that appears two times. Tahom, of course, is Tiamat in the parallel ancient East stories. And on top of all that, we have a verse that's very familiar to probably all of us, which is Mi chamocha ba'elim Hashem, Mi kamocha nedar ba'kodesh, who was like you for Elim? And the simple reading of Elim is gods. That's what Elim are. Who was like you amongst the gods, right? Unless we think that that's some kind of heretical statement. I mean, heretical or not, it's what it says. But we have to remember that when God spoke to Moshe, God told Moshe, we're going to defeat the Egyptians. Uvachol Elohei Mitzrayim esesh shvatim ani Hashem. And amongst the God of the Egyptians, I will render judgment. So it's clear that when God speaks to Moshe in Egypt, God talks about defeating the gods of the Egyptians. So what you have in Shirat Hayam then is, of course, it's about the Egyptian army, no doubt about that. But the point is that the poem, at the very same time, is alluding to the fact that God and the stated purpose of God said this many times, you will know, God, remember before each of the sets of three plagues, there's a reason given for the plagues. And the last one is, you will know, I think it's the last one of the second set, Ein kamoni b'chol haaretz. We're teaching Pharaoh a lesson. First, I exist. There's no God like me. I exist within the land, and there's Ein kamoni, there's no God like me. And over here, we have exactly that verse, Mi chamocha ba'elim Hashem. So what you have over here in Shirat Hayam is two things happening simultaneously. One is it's a song about God defeating the Egyptians, but at the very same time, there's a kind of reference to a different creation narrative, not the one we encountered in the first chapter of the Torah, which is this effort, and there's nobody else. There's one God, there's no Tanin, there's no nothing, there's no Yam, there's no Tahom. Here is different. You have in the
you see it in the prose version also, right? What are the last words before the Shira starts? Like it's clear, right? That's the main effort. That's the point of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And now we're singing a song about it also.
For sure. And you have, by the way, just thinking at the beginning of the Torah, the Choshech al Pnei Tahom, there you do have it. So you have a sense that yes, there is this Tahom there, but throughout the entire first chapter, it sounds like there's no real struggle at all. It's just, I mean, some people want to argue that there still is some kind of a struggle. John Levinson makes that argument. But the simple reading of the Torah is that, as far as chapter 1 is concerned, there's no. So this is actually, so it's very interesting actually to read the song on two different levels and to think of it in terms of this is playing off a different narrative, a narrative that there are these other forces out there, but that God is better, God is stronger. They're not the same as God. Mi kamocha, they're not the same. Let me just pause here for a moment if people want to comment about that, and then I want to get to the main point I wanted to put out there, which I think is good food for thought. If anybody wants to speak up, please do.
Could you repeat the second idea?
Right. The point of Kasuto has two ideas. One is the first idea of Kasuto is that chapter 1 of Genesis is describing a God who has no opposition. There's no struggle. there's no effort, and it's just words. God says, and there is. But even Tanin, there's no struggle. That's the first point Kasuta made. But Kasuta made a second point, that in other parts of the Bible, he talks largely about the poetic sections of the Bible. There are references. We could check it out and find maybe 20 references, maybe more, which do seem to describe a different creation story where there's a struggle, there's a battle where God defeats God's enemies. Some of the verses in Slichot, I recall now from Psalms, actually are pretty explicit about it. God defeats this, God defeats that, God defeats this one. And the Micha Mocha theme, there's none like it. They're not as good as you are, you're better. But that's a different sense of creation, that upon creation, there's a struggle, there's a war. I mean, the ones who picked this up and ran with it were the Kabbalists. Kabbalists see evil as a reality. The Kabbalists see evil, God is fighting with evil. That's the Kabbalist, the Zohar and the Kabbalistic texts, some to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent. And the point that I'm making is that within the song of the Yam, Shirat HaYam, there is that sense actually that it's not a kind of God with no opposition. There are other forces, there are other Elim, there is Yam, there is Tahom, but they're not as good, they're not as strong. Micha Mocha, who's like you, you can vanquish them, you can defeat them. That's what I suggest to this point. And that leads us to the next point, which is extremely interesting point, which is the main point I'd like to make. But somebody wants to...
There's kind of two ways to read that, right? One way to read it is, yes, like the Kabbalist read is like, yes, there are other forces in the world that are not God, that are extra, like, super powerful beings, and that God is basically at war against evil, and that's what these texts reflect. The other way to read it is that was the best we could hope for their monotheism at this time, and that they had to understand it in that way, but that's not like the MS way of understanding it.
One could say that, right? I mean, let's put it this way. I think that the Kabbalistic, but Gershom Shalom made the point that the main point with the Kabbalists, he argued, he always tried to argue that Kabbalists broke with tradition, and Ido always argued that the Kabbalists are working within certain traditions. But his point is that the real marker of the Kabbalistic view versus, say, the philosophers, Kabbalists took evil very seriously, and the Kabbalists believe that evil is a reality, and God, for whatever reason, has not fully overcome it. And I would say that the Jewish people actually, in this respect, have adopted the view of the Kabbalists and not the philosophers. You won't find too many people who, if the question about the Shoah, for example, why did 2 million children, why were they murdered in the Shoah? Because of our sins. I think people would, when you say that, I don't say it, but if one says that they all died because of our sins, because the mezuzahs weren't kosher or for whatever reason, I think that the Jewish people in general would not suffer that silently. I don't think that we think in those terms. We say because there's evil in the world. The world is filled with evil, and the Jews are the victim. But I don't think we would necessarily presume that the world is perfectly good and that human beings have sort of messed it up. We have messed things up. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think that the idea that evil is some kind of reality in the world, my understanding is that the people that I'm familiar with, I know, for the most part, that's their mode of thinking. Whether they believe in the Kabbalistic system or not, I'm not saying that. But the idea that there is evil, and it's not because of our sins or whatever that good people suffer, it's because the world is this way, and we have to try to deal with the world as it is. So I would say that, I think that's, at least my experience is that the people that I know pretty much, that's their mode of thinking for the most part. Okay, so let me just make the one last observation about this parasha, and then I'm happy to hear everybody.
Rabbi Silber?
Yes.
Rabbi? Hi, it's Ray Fink. I would just,
Hi, Ray.
I was just contemplating, actually, sorry to go back, but your description of the different shears on the Yam, and I'm thinking that it appears to me that this is a transitional story about moving from childhood to adulthood. as a child, you need to know that your parents are taking care of everything. And that's the first Shir Hayam. They're children. God is taking care of all their needs, and they're going to do everything. But then as the story evolves and we move through the Midbar and then we come into Canaan, there are these breaks, as you described them. And each break has a different song. And the songs are different. And the difference is you're not a child anymore. Now you're going to take some own responsibility. It's not just, you can't just evoke God's name for every battle that you take on, because that results in hubris. And we don't want to create a people where every time you think you're going to go to war, you're going to say, I'm doing it because God told me to do it. It's under God's banner, because that was Shir Hayam. And I think that there's a message there. At least that's the way I read it.
Right. I think that your description of moving from, say, from childhood to adulthood is very much on target. I fully agree with that. I think that's the story of the Torah, actually. It's a story from slavery. We don't have the opportunity to make decisions. It's not in our power. Moving towards a land that we're going to possess, and we're responsible to set up the institutions of the land, whether it's the judges, whether it's the king, whether it's the priesthood functioning a certain way, the role of the prophet, which is the book of Dvarim. And you set this up, and you visit God 3 times a year, but fundamentally, the Torah speaks of a kind of autonomous nation, which we should learn from our past. For example, what it means to be a slave. We shouldn't impose on others what we know to be wrong, because we ourselves know from our parents and grandparents, maybe from our own experience, what it means to suffer. So I think the story, I think the model that you present, I think it's very true. I think the goal ultimately in the Torah is to establish a space, a place, which operates, which understands what God would want of us to do, but we're responsible ourselves for doing it. I believe that is the move in the Torah from Egypt to move it going into the land, and having learned from our past, giving that experience in Egypt of suffering, of being a stranger, enslaved, etc., to set up a society that is equitable and compassionate. I think that's I think that is, it's my read of the Torah anyway, and it sort of conforms to what you're saying. And there always are, in other words, if you're a slave, as Leah pointed out before, you're fully dependent on somebody else. You can't make your own choices. Time is not yours. And Shirat Hayam, there's absolutely no reference whatsoever to human beings. We're just witnesses, but God does everything. Shirat HaBe'er, they left out God's name altogether. And that's because that's a generation that were never slaves. And that's, you see this in life where they don't have the restraint and they don't have a sense of, we can do it all. And that's what Moshe warns them in the book of Dvarim. Don't think you did it yourself. That's his main musar he gives in Sefer Dvarim. Don't think kochi v'yotzem yadi.
But they're already thinking about it in Parashat Bo, right? They're already thinking, how am I going to, 3 times, right? How am I going to tell my children about this? And by the way, right, something so beautiful about that is like, yeah, you're going to have children. You're not going to have to like throw them into the Nile. You'll be able to actually have the autonomy to tell your story. And in some ways, that's like the first little, like, I don't know, to me, that's like one of the first like sparkles of like where this is going and what freedom will look like.
Right. I think with Leah's point, I think I would add to what she's saying, which is, you see this in certain societies, the generation gap, you want to call it that way, is because they're living in a completely different, I think we have this problem actually, in very, very serious problem. For those who had any experience dealing with the Ethiopian Jews in Israel, who came from Ethiopia, and what happens is when they come there, that in Ethiopia, it's a system where the parents, especially the father, was very, honored because the father was the breadwinner, and you come into a new land and doesn't speak the language, the kids can learn the language, the kids can learn computers, and the question is, and the kids suddenly, their own traditions, unfortunately, and some people encourage this, are sort of minimized or forgotten. And there you have this real problem of trying to teach young Jews to honor their own traditions. There's a lot to be said for it, and to try to figure out a way that the older generation doesn't lose respect in the eyes of the new generation, given the tremendous differences in the society. So you have it. So Leah's point is, I think, very, very on target in terms of the two generations are so different, and how do you actually, move from one to the other? I would say within our own tradition, there's a tremendous emphasis. The Seder is that way, of trying to connect to all the generations and to recognize that, in terms of the United States, I mean, the people that came over typically came over with very little. Most of them, a hard percentage, had to really struggle to make it. And their children and grandchildren were, if you measure success by integration into the country, very successful. But very often we forget how we got here, and I think that's always a big challenge. So that is one of the challenges for sure. And the Torah goes out of its way to talk about what the stories that we tell our children, which is part of the Seder, part of Shemot, and throughout the Chumash, I think, as well.
And I think music can really play a role in that, right? Like I guess the feeling of, and you opened with this, is like, it's not like this song was sung one time in the history of the Jewish people and then we put it aside forever. Like we say it in full once a day, and we reference it at least twice a day, if not more. Like the creation, music has this incredible role to play in the transmission of intergenerational memory. And in the ability to kind of encapsulate an experience and then give it to someone else, because the music itself has the ability of transporting you emotionally.
And also it helps you remember. For those of us who read the Torah, if you read the Torah as a kid, actually, you tend to remember it actually. So we actually, songs help us, some people, when they get older, they sort of lose their memories, and somehow song, though, is something they can still connect to. So there's something to be said for that as well, for sure. I think that's, and we haven't even focused on the song dimension, song and poetry. It's which is also very, very striking over here. I did want to mention one more thing in terms of the Parashah, and that is that in the Song of the Sea, so in the middle of it, it talks not just about the Egyptians, actually, but in the middle of the song, it makes the point that this event of crossing the sea and the Egyptian, our enemy, being defeated, that this had sort of almost a cosmic effect on the world. And Torah says, it's beginning in verse number 14, Shamu amim yirgazun chilachaz yoshvei Parashat, az nivalu alufei Edom elei molav yochazei murad, namogu kol yoshvei Canaan tipo alehem a mata v'fachad. So it talks about the different nations of the world, and actually there's 7 different words for fear. Yirgazun is 1, Chil is 2, Nivhalu is 3, Rad is 4, Nomogu is 5, Ema is 6, and Pachad is 7. So there were 7 different words, and refers to the nations of the world. When this happened, the world is trembling before God's might. God is the center. Israel not mentioned. We don't do anything. We are witnesses to this revelation of this powerful God who delivers us and who defeats not only our enemies, but God's enemies, which is part of the references to these other forces out there. This is chapter 15. Now, what's interesting is the way this week's Parashah ends. And this is something that I think is a very, very, very big deal, something to think about. The end of the Parashah, because the journey begins after the Song of the Sea. We walk through the desert, and of course we complain. First we complain about the water, which is a valid complaint, you need water. Then we complain we have no food. That's the story of the man, chapter 16. Okay, but then we come to another place in Refidim towards the very end of the Parsha, and we once again complain about the water, complain very bitterly about the water. At this point, God gets upset with us. After all, God has given us water, God has given us food, God has demonstrated God's concern and God's care. What are we complaining about? Well, we complain. A place called Massa and Meriva. Okay. And after this episode, which is the first, I would say, 7 verses of chapter 17, then suddenly, Vayavo Amalek, Vayilachem im Yisrael birfidim. So Amalek came, and Amalek fought with Israel in a place called Refidim. And Moshe tells Yoshua, the first time we discover Yoshua, he's given no introduction. Moshe said to Yoshua, gather up some people and go and fight against Amalek. I'm going to go to the top of the mountain, and take the staff of God in my hands. Yoshua does so. Moshe goes to the top of the mountain with Aaron and Hur, his brother, and Hur, whoever Hur may be. It's not for now, but he goes with these two people. The Torah says the strangest thing. When Moshe would raise his hands up, Israel would be victorious. When he put his hands down, the Gavar Amalek. Bidei Moshe Kavedi, Moshe's hands were heavy. So they took a rock and he sat down. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side, one on the other side. And he was able to be steady until nightfall. And Joshua, Vayacharosh Yoshua, et Amalek v'et Amo, Joshua weakened Amalek and his people by the sword. So Yoshua is successful, didn't destroy Amalek, but defeats Amalek. And then God says to Moshe, write this down in the book. That's how the parasha ends. Ketov zikaron b'sefer, that I will wipe out Amalek from under the heavens. And Moshe builds an altar. He says, God is my banner. And Moshe said, Kiyad al case you have, there's an oath. I swear or God swears. Sounds like God is swearing. Milchamah Hashem b'Amalek midar dar. A war of God against Amalek in every generation. Now, I just wanted to reflect on this for a few moments. I mean, this is a story which is of supreme significance, actually. And Amalek in general is of supreme significance. It appears in very central stories of the Bible. It appears in the story of downfall of King Saul. It appears very prominently in a book we're going to read not too far down the road called Megillat Esther, where the enemy is an Amalekite. Agag is the king of Amalek. So Amalek is a very significant story. And I just wanted to put out there two ways to read Amalek, two different ways to read Amalek. Because the truth of the matter is, as the Medrash noted, that in the Song of the Sea says that all the nations of the world, Shavua Mim Yirgazu, all the nations of the world are trembling, all of them. And it singles out several of them by name, including Edom. Edom, Elei Moab, Oznevaru, Alufei Edom. The chieftains of Edom were terrified. So there are 7 terms for fear, but all the nations, when at the revelation of the sea, the nations are frightened. But here, just less than 2 chapters later, Vayavo Amalek, Amalek comes and fights against Israel. And the point I would just make one small point here, and I'll stop and hopefully people will speak up and we'll hear from people. Leah will certainly have something to add. Amalek can be seen in 2 different ways. There are 2 different faces of Amalek. First of all, Amalek in the Chumash is actually Esav's grandson. Esav's grandson. So one way to understand Amalek is that Amalek attacks Israel when Israel is weak. And Israel is weak because in the previous story, they are complaining once again about God. They're questioning whether God is in our midst at all. The last verse before Amalek, the people tested God and said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayim, is God truly with us or not? Even though God's been supporting us the entire time. At the sea, the plagues, the sea, the water, the food, more water, but the people still question. Vayavu Amalek, so Amalek senses an insecurity of sorts, and Amalek attacks Israel when Israel is actually weak. And Amalek is Israel's enemy who takes advantage of our weakness, discovers a weakness. For example, in the book of in the scroll of Esther, Megillat Esther, what does Haman say to the king? There's a nation out there, don't have their own state. They're Befuzaru Mefora. They're here, they're there, they have no army, there's no central. It's not worthwhile to keep them alive. They're easy prey for us. We'll just knock them off. So when Amalek sees the opportunity to attack the weak, and especially the Israelites, they attack. And this Amalek, we can trace it back to Esau. We can trace it back to the piece of Esau that resents the fact that Jacob took advantage of Esau's weakness, of Isaac's weakness, etc. That's one kind of Amalek. And Amalek is our enemy. And Amalek is the world's enemy, maybe, but especially Israel's enemy. That's one Amalek. Then there's another Amalek, actually, which is not primarily about Israel at all, actually. And this Amalek, actually, is an instantiation of the Nachash in the beginning of the Torah, the snake. You see, in the first chapter of Genesis, God creates everything with no effort, including the tanin, the serpent. But in the second creation story, there's also a serpent. In fact, there's synonyms in the Bible. Tanin and Nachash are synonyms. And in that story, it's the snake who actually takes on God, who actually attacks God, and I would say defeats God. Because in the second creation story, God has a plan to have a special space within creation where the human and God can share the space. The snake resents that. Why should the human get the space? I'm brighter than the human. I'm arum. They're arumim. They're naked, but I'm arum. I'm wise. I know more than they do. I know about the tree of knowledge. So why them? And the snake resents the God who set it up for the human. So the snake is out to get God primarily and God's favorite creature, the human. How can you defeat God? You can defeat God because the snake always attacks at the point of weakness. The snake bites you with the heel, an Achilles heel. The snake attacks you with, what is God's weakness? God has no weaknesses. Yes, God has a weakness. The weakness of God is the thing that God created in God's image. It's Samo Kidmuto. And that's where the snake sets out to attack. And the snake actually goes to the woman, not to the man. And the reason is she was never commanded not to eat of the fruit. The man was commanded. She knows of the command. She was never commanded. So goes to the one who was never commanded and entices her, it coaxes her to eat it, and she gives to Adam. And then the story ends with the banishment from Eden. God's plan has been defeated. Scorecard, snake won, and God nothing. The snake wins that battle. And the point is over here, what's interesting is that the Amalek over here is represented more than Israel's enemy, is represented as God's enemy. And the reason for that is because whereas Shirat Hayam was a demonstration of God's power to the entire world, but Amalek represents the piece of creation that God does not contain. See, if you go to the second creation narrative, if you go to the second alternative of Kasuto, this is what Levinson writes about. He writes about it in chapter 1, which I think is not correct. But the idea of it, which is Kasuto's idea, I think is correct, which is once you're talking about a struggle between God and other gods, once there's actually a battle, that leaves open the possibility that God has defeated God's enemies, but has not vanquished them. They still in some form exist. And when you read it that way, what Amalek represents is the piece of creation that for whatever reason, God has not yet contained. And that's what it says. There's a war of God against Amalek in every generation, which means they're always around. That for whatever reason, you can give 100 explanations. God chooses it to be that way. It's a question how radical a theology you have. But for whatever reason, God has permitted, or for whatever reason, this thing to exist, this Amalek to exist. So the idea that Amalek, who always attacks at the weakest point, that's their MO, whether it's Haman, whether it's Amalek and King Saul, who doesn't get it, spiritual, who's morally weak, he doesn't understand, whether it's Israel who says, Ayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayim, whatever it is, in these cases, in all cases, it's the same MO. So what Amalek then represents is the piece of creation that God has, for whatever reason, not yet subdued. It's a war against God in every generation. So the Amalek story then makes perfect sense in terms of the Song of the Sea. If you read the Song of the Sea as referencing that other creation narrative, then what Amalek represents is, yes, it's the other creation narrative, but God is the persistence of evil, because God has not, for whatever reason, vanquished these forces. So that's what I would argue. If we had more time, I could demonstrate how this plays out in the. Let me just say one last point about Amalek, which is so central to the Bible, and that is that there were two different pieces to Amalek. The Amalek that's Esau's grandson is primarily Israel's enemy, resents what Jacob did to his grandfather. It's the piece of Esau that doesn't forgive Jacob. But the other Amalek, which takes us back to the snake, there actually it's not primarily Israel's enemy. It is Israel's enemy because God has favored Israel. It's God's enemy, and it is humanity's enemy. God says to the snake, "You are your children and the children of the woman will be eternal enemies." Right? It's no Jews. It's about humanity. Amalek is the enemy of all humanity. They may start with Israel because God has favored them, they're covenantal or whatever, but it's really not about Israel. But the other Amalek is about Israel. And one last interesting point about Amalek, that in chapter 14 of Genesis, which describes Abraham's battle against the four kings, and the four kings have defeated the different nations of the land, one of them is actually Amalek. So the commentaries are troubled by that. Stay Amaleki. So I have something to say about that. But that Amalek actually is, the Torah is connecting it to the early inhabitants of the land, the giants, etc., who were seen as God's adversary. So I'll stop at this point. That's what I wanted to say about the Parashah. And then please, in the remaining time, speak up.
Okay, so here's my question. The Gemara in Masachet Shabbos, Kof Yud Chad Amud Bet 118b says, Ilmale, this is in the name of Rav, Ilmale Shamar Yisrael Shabbat Rishonah, Lo Shal Tabahen Uma Velashon. So had the Jewish people properly observe the first Shabbos, that's in Parashat Haman, that's in Shemot 16, right? Hashem tells Moshe, here's what's going to be with the man. There's going to be a double portion on Friday. Moshe doesn't really tell it over to the people, right? And they're all confused about it. And then on Shabbos, when no man falls and they're not supposed to go out and collect, some people go out and collect. So the Gemara says, Rav says in the Gemara, if they had actually, and then Hashem is angry at Moshe. So the Gemara, Rav says, had the Jewish people properly observed that first Shabbos, no nation or tongue would have ever ruled over them. Shenamar, and it brings from the man, and it happened on the seventh day. Some people went out from the nation to collect. And then it says, so it's written after that they went to go collect the man, and then Amalek came to fight with Israel and Rephidim. So you're saying that it's about this, like, wait, we leave space maybe for the like pieces of non-God dominion when the people didn't fully believe. But it seems like the Rav thinks, at least in that piece of the Gemara, Rav thinks that it's not exactly like, oh, God isn't here or God didn't believe, but there's actually something like inherent to Shabbos that lets in Amalek.
Right. I mean, I guess one could interpret that in a variety of ways. I mean, we could make the point that, one way to, you have it in the Megillah, basically, one way to, there's an Amalek that takes advantage of people's weaknesses. One of the weaknesses is a spiritual weakness, a lack of faith. I mean, I think that Shabbos stands in for a full recognition of God's kingship, of God's presence and kingship in the world. And it is certainly the case that the lead in verse to Amalek is Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu Rabbi. That we can't deny. So I think that, I mean, my take on the Megillah is that what the Mordechai and Esther, the letter they send around for the future, is to strengthen the Jewish community. That one of the ways to safeguard oneself, I mean militarily, but to safeguard the Jewish identity is by strengthening Jewish connections to God. I think that's personally a very important thought. I think that, again, the kind of work we're doing at Drisha, kind of work you're doing, Leah, and your programs and the yeshiva and all that, you build people, actually. If you strengthen the Jewish community and connect them to the tradition and give them education, knowledge, I think that many of the problems that confront us in terms of assimilation, different attacks on the Jewish people, if we're resolute in what we do and have a good understanding of our tradition and a faith in it, I think that is to some extent a protective mechanism. Is the other Amalek, look, evil exists, and you can be a righteous person and you can still be, that's another conversation. You can be a righteous. Look, I grew up with people of the Shoah, and the fact of the matter is that 90% of the Jews in Poland were murdered. and a much smaller percentage of the Jews, say in Germany, were murdered. And the reason is simple. They knew what was happening. They got out. They had the wherewithal to get out. So understanding the world and really understanding it is obviously very central. But I think on the other side of it, what you cite is this idea that were we able actually to really understand, God's plan and the nature of God's values and God's teachings. Look, the fact of the matter is that the Jews who left Egypt on several occasions say they want to go back to Egypt. That's just the reality of the Torah. It takes a generation to figure out that we don't belong, to really understand what Mitzrayim represents. So maybe that's part of it, but that's what I would say. Does anybody else have a comment or question?
I was thinking back on something from before, and I think that what really crystallizes the first and second generation is the question from, is the story of Reuven and Gad when they go to Moshe and they speak the dialogue between them about when they ask for the land on the other side of the Yarden. They don't make a request the first time, they just announce that the land is good for cattle, and that's the land and we have cattle, and Moshe doesn't respond, and then it says Vayomru a second time, and they say Im matzanu chen be'einecha, and then they speak appropriately, and they don't use the name of Hashem, they just say we will go and fight, and Moshe has to try to educate them again and bring in the whole time Lifnei Hashem. It's really a clash between their outlook of the second generation and his trying to educate them of where their correct place is. It really puts into high, sharp contrast the first generation and the second generation in that one story.
I'm not understanding. You're saying that are they the first generation or the second?
No, they're the second generation. I think it's in Matos.
No, I would say the opposite. The opposite. He says to them, "Koasu avotechem." No, the opposite. They're talking like the first generation. This is what your ancestors did with the spies. He says, "You haven't learned anything in 40 years." He accuses them of not learning. Later they make a deal.
Right, but the way they approach it is that they will do it. They don't involve God in it at all in their language. That's what I'm pointing out.
That part is true, but on the other hand, you also don't want to cross over. They don't want to possess the land. I mean, yes, right. There's a self-sufficiency, but, right? Yeah, they're both true. Right. They don't mention God. That's true. If they Hashem, Moshe says it 5 times, but right. They don't want to cross. He says, you're the same as the first. You're the same as the first generation, he says. Right. All right. I think we'll stop at this point then. If anybody has any comments or questions, you can email us. I'm Silber@Drisha.org. What's your email, Leah?
Sarna@Drisha.org.
Sarna@Drisha.org. Okay. Thank you all very much. Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Silber, and thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna, and many, many thanks to everyone who joined us today. Always lovely to see you here in our classes at Drisha, and we also hope to see you next week. We do have another class coming up in less than a half an hour at 2 p.m. Eastern. I'd love to see you there as well. It is a class that's just starting today with Rabbi Zachary Trubov. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, looking into the postmodern piety of Rav Shadar. We also have many more classes happening other than these 2 classes, so please check out our website at www.drisha.org, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. Lehitraot.